Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I wanted to bless you with my very first build making guide. Over the last 1 year, I've been lucky enough to make a bunch of builds that have made a pretty decent impact on Last Epoch's community just because of how powerful and good they were at clearing content. Perhaps the best indicator of the impact of some of these builds is how much attention they have gathered from EHG. Many of my builds were nerfed significantly. Some were nerfed so much that they were basically deleted from the game. Some of the builds managed to optimize and utilize skills that nobody else in the community was using, and they did so to a great success. And throughout that time, I was asked quite a few times about my build making process, and I hadn't thought about it enough to be able to make a guide on it until now. My intent with this video is to create a framework and communicate to new players as well as veteran players how I go about creating and optimizing builds in a generalized way such that it can apply to future patches as well. I'm going to use specific builds as examples to illustrate and communicate what I'm trying to get across, but the information will be fairly generalized so they can fit any build, any class, and also remain relevant through future patches. And let me start by saying that making builds in Last Epoch is truly one of the most rewarding aspects in the game. EHG have done a tremendous job with it, and that's the reason that I'm still here making builds, enjoying the game, having played it over 2,000 hours now, and I'm having a blast. I can't wait until 1.0, and that's why I hope all of you give that same experience a try. Try making your own build.
Today is the first day of the rest of your life. What are you doing?
Without a YouTube build guide, without a content creator looking over your shoulder, just on your own.
This is the first day of the rest of your life, but what kind of life will it be, huh? Will it be a life of fear, of, oh, no, I can't do this, of never once believing in yourself?
Testing one skill after another and seeing what works.
How about you take some of these chemicals and mix up some rocket fuel? That way you can just send up a signal flare. Or you make some kind of robot to get us help, or a homing device, or build a new battery, or like a doom buggy.
Worst case scenario is that you learn a lot more about the game. Trust me, that's how that process works. Even if your build sucks, you're going to end up with a lot of knowledge that you can utilize in perhaps a future build. And in the occasional scenario where your build ends up performing extremely well, you're going to be patting yourself on the back and feeling like the guy who just invented bread.
Yes, science!
I should also mention a few caveats that it's quite possible that ESG introduce new game mechanics in the future, and so at some point in time this framework will become slightly less relevant. But if you understand the overall concept, you can apply it even with the addition of new game elements, so this video can still be valuable. Anyways, that was a long intro. Let's just jump in. Irashaimase! So I put down the core concepts for this guide inside a Google Docs. And so that's what I'm using here today. And I've tried to separate what I think is most important in creating a good build into a bunch of different categories. But before we go into any of these categories, if you are a new player, the most important thing that I would recommend for you is to just, and this is going to sound quite silly, to just play the game. As much as we can try and create a framework and formulate how we can optimize the build, none of that is useful if you don't have a good feel or a good intuition as to the core mechanics within the game. Even simple things like hitboxes, AoEs of certain skills, you should know those inside and out so that you can understand better how you can optimize certain things within it. And acquiring that feel and intuition for the game can only happen by playing it. There are certain things that you just can't make a guide about. So make sure to put in the hours and then enhance your understanding of the game with this framework in order to make a solid build. Now let's talk about some of the categories that I wanted to discuss here. The first one that I'm starting off with is damage. And the next one, everybody is going to be familiar with as well, is defensive layers. I personally like to prioritize damage when I'm first starting to make my builds, because if a build meets a certain damage threshold, that to me is an indication that I should invest more time into the build, optimizing the damage further or optimizing the defensive layers further. If my starting point is defensive layers, that is less frequently going to end up in a useful build. I think damage is more important in general, and so that is my first test. Can the build with some minimal investment on my side get, let's call it decent, damage? It is also possible that I am maybe slightly biased towards damage builds or even glass cannon builds. I have been known to be a little bit skimpy on the defensive layers at times, but I try to optimize those as much as possible after I've gone through multiple optimization phases on the damage side. So with today's video, I'm probably only going to have time to cover damage just because I don't want to be making a 2-3 hour video. So starting out with the most important optimization parameter in every single ARPG, your damage. Within the damage category, I've tried to split every single build into 3 different types. There are hit builds, and those can be spell, melee, bow, or throwing, as well as ailment dot builds. And then there are damage over time builds that don't utilize any ailments. So these are, for example, Earthquake Aftershock, Static Orb, Static Ground, Glyph of Dominion, etc. Regardless of the type of build that you're trying to optimize or you're trying to make, the most important thing to keep in mind with all of them is more multipliers. And this is a key wording within Last Epoch and nowadays many other ARPGs as well. If a skill node says it gives you more damage, that means that the percentage in that skill node is multiplicative with other damage bonuses. On the other hand, increased percent damage is generally considered to be a additive bonus with other increased percent damages that contribute to the exact same pool of increased damage. And what that means is more damage multipliers scale better, but whereas increased percent damage have a diminishing return. And when it comes to more damage multipliers, you have to be really careful with the language that ESG has chosen and utilized within the skill nodes that you're reading. Certain skill nodes have a generic wording like this one where it says, whatever skill deals more damage. That kind of more multiplier applies to all 3 of these categories. There are also more damage multipliers that are specific to ailments like this one. So that's only going to apply to ailment dot builds in this middle category. And then there are skill nodes that specifically let you know that this skill deals more hit damage. That is only going to be applicable to the first category of hit-based skill builds. And then there are also skill nodes that are only going to apply to the damage over time damage. That is specific only to the dot-based builds. So you have to be very careful and make sure that you read every single more multiplier so that you know exactly what it applies to. Even when it comes to more multipliers, you still want to do a little bit of math to make sure that you're getting the most out of every single point that you invest. So let me illustrate. Let's say that you have exactly 2 points in Shatterquake, and you're left with the choice of putting an additional points in Shatterquake. And let's also assume that enemies are always chilled just for simplicity here. And now you have the choice of putting an additional point in Shatterquake versus an additional point in Crushing Quake. Shatterquake gives you 30% more damage per point, while Crushing Wake only gives you 20. If we don't do any math here, we're just going to assume that 30% is the better choice. However, the way that this math works out is that the 30% that we're investing in here is additive on the pre-existing 60%. So you're essentially raising your damage from 160% to 190%. And if you do a quick little calculation, 190 divided by 160, that gives you 1.1875. That is the damage multiplier that you're getting by investing this extra point. On the other side, Crushing Wake, you have 0 points in it, so the 20% is going to apply just as it is. You're going to have a 1.2 times multiplier. So it turns out that an extra point in Crushing Wake is superior to an extra point in Shatterquake. This is a 1.2 times multiplier, and this is a 1.1875 multiplier. And so what I wanted to demonstrate with that example right there is that understanding of how the numbers within the game get added up is incredibly important in optimizing your build. It's not enough to just say, oh, go for the more damage multipliers. The ones with the higher numbers are always better. No, that is not true. Sometimes the ones with lower numbers are better if we actually go through and do the math. But generally speaking, more damage multipliers are the best way to scale your build. Next, if you're running a hit build, most well-designed and well-performing hit builds are going to be running max crit with at least, let's say, 300% crit multi. Some of them can go up to like 500%. And the reason for running 100% crit is critical multiplier is essentially another more multiplier. It's independent and stacks multiplicatively with other damage scaling elements within the game. Now, if you keep going, when it comes to hit builds, you definitely want to increase your flat damage as well. And what I mean by that is if you look at this cleaver solution, it has the implicits of 90 melee damage. That is the flat damage that the weapon has. But we can also add a tier 7 melee physical damage, 45 to 55. That is another source of melee flat physical damage. For spells, I think this is called adaptive damage, but it accomplishes the exact same thing. It's just flat damage that gets multiplied by percent damage scaling of the skill, and then by more multipliers, and then by your crit multi, and then by potentially armor shred effects on the enemy, etc., etc. Dot skills also benefit from increased flat damage, so you want to make sure to bump that up for those skills as well. Ailments, on the other hand, you don't want to invest in this stat. For hit builds, you also want to invest in armor shred chance and armor shred effect. Let's go to this really useful website that has a bunch of tools relating to Last Epoch. It's called Dunk Lab. I'll include a link to it in the description below. But what you're seeing right here is the effect of armor shred stacks. If you can apply 100 armor shred stacks on the enemy, that will make your physical hit damage 77% higher versus that enemy. And you can clearly see the diminishing returns, where if you get it up to, let's say, 300 stacks, that only increases the damage that the enemy takes from 77 to 83. That is a very marginal increase. And for that reason, most builds aim for somewhere along 70 to 150 armor shred stacks on the enemy. That's going to give you anywhere between 70 to 80% more multiplier on your physical damage, as well as 50 to 57% non-physical damage multiplier on your skills. And the way that armor shred effect works is if you have 100% increased armor shred effect, you basically can just divide the number of desired armor shred stacks by 2. So instead of aiming for, let's say, 100 armor shred stacks, you can just aim for 50, because every armor shred stack is twice as effective. If we were to further generalize things, we can just think of this armor shred chance and effect as yet another more damage multiplier for your hit-based builds. And it is a multiplier that essentially soft caps out fairly quickly because of diminishing returns. Next, what we have here is added damage scaling. This is incredibly important as well. And what it is referring to is, if you read every single skill, the base damage, you can see that there is an added damage scaling, in this case 350% for earthquake. That is essentially a multiplier for your flat melee physical damage. So right here we have 45 to 55. That melee physical damage is going to get multiplied by 3.5 in order to calculate your earthquake damage. Every single skill has a different added damage scaling. Swipe has 100, Avalanche has 300%, and it can make or break many of your builds. For a very long time, Inferno Shade had this sub-skill called Fire Burst, and it still has, in fact. But for a very long time, that skill was shared with 2 or 3 other skills within other classes. And all of these skills had different ways of triggering. And perhaps because of that, all of them had a pathetic 25% added damage scaling. So even though Fiery Conclusion had a very healthy 200% damage multiplier, it was just not enough to get that pathetic added damage scaling to a significant amount. You can see that it now has 100% added damage scaling. Probably not enough just yet, but it is far better than what it was in the past. So you have to pay attention to the added damage scaling of every single skill that you're considering using. It is highly relevant for both hit builds and dot builds, which is why I've added it on both sides. When it comes to ailment-specific affixes and skill nodes that you want to take into consideration when trying to min-max your ailment-based build, the most important one is ailment percent chance per hit. This is essentially how many ailments you're going to be applying with every single hit that you proc with a skill. Next, ailment duration is great as well. A lot of the ailments have 2.5, perhaps 3 second duration. And so duration is essentially a more damage multiplier against enemies that survive past that initial 2.5 seconds. So this one is most useful against bosses because they won't be dying in that 2.5 to 3 second interval. There are certain skills, and these are not very numerous at all, probably 2 or 3 in the entire game, that allow you to deal your ailment damage instantly. So you may have stacked up 100, let's say, bleed stacks that have 3 seconds remaining on them. And within those 3 seconds, that might represent, let's say, 1,000,000 worth of damage. There are skills that can trigger that 1,000,000 damage and proc it instantly so you don't have to wait the 3 seconds. That's something else to consider. It's a little bit niche, but it can be very useful against bosses because some of those insta procs also come along with damage multipliers as well. And at the bottom here, I have listed attributes that improve the damage across all 3 of these categories. Attack and cast speed is a no-brainer. Most skills benefit from attack and cast speed. The one category that might be slightly less dependent on attack and cast speed would probably be the dot category. You can think of skills like Glyph of Dominion. You can have a maximum of 1, so attack and cast speed doesn't really do much. Another good example is Static Orb, Static Ground, the way it used to function back in, let's say, March. You kind of just wanted to cast 1 and then wait another 3 or 4 seconds until you cast another one. So cast speed was nowhere nearly as important as for some other builds. There's also Rest, Shred, and Penetration. If your main damage type is, let's say, Necrotic, penetrating the enemy's resistances essentially is another more damage multiplier. If you have 0 penetration, 15% penetration is a 15% more damage. Shredding enemy necrotic resistance is additive with your necrotic penetration, so you have to keep that in mind. These two are additive with each other. Increased percent damage is something else that can give you a good boost to the damage of your build. However, you have to keep in mind that all sources of increased percent damage, including ones that come from your attributes, for attribute scaling within the skill that you're using. So like right here, Earthquake has per point of attunement or strength, 4% increased damage. That is additive with other sources of increased damage. Let's say we're utilizing Earthquake as a physical skill. If you have percent increased physical damage on your ring slots, that is very much additive with the percent increased damage from your attributes, which makes it so that increased percent damage very much suffers from diminishing returns to scale. You don't want to overinvest in this attribute. Enemies take increased damage is another essentially more damage multiplier. Your general attributes like strength, dexterity, intelligence, attunement, and vitality will always add, let's say, 4% increased damage to every single skill, but they will also add some survivability by contributing to some of your defensive layers. So attribute investment is very situational. Some builds want a lot of certain attributes and some do not. Cooldown reduction, again, highly situational. Some builds require it to dish out more damage or to even survive more, whereas some builds don't care about CDR whatsoever. I'm just listing it here because situationally it can lead to a huge damage increase for your build. Void Knight Echoes are class specific and they're only available to the Void Knight and mostly through their passive skill tree, through these nodes over here, Echo Chance plus X%, but they're very much a more damage multiplier. Having a 40% chance to proc the skill one more time is essentially 40% more damage. And there are ways to scale these echoes. Some skills can increase the damage of the echoes. There are also affixes on your chest piece that can increase them as well. So they can be a useful way of increasing your damage as well. Just keep in mind that that damage is delayed, so it won't proc as early as your initial hit. So let me highlight a few things here that are incredibly important and I think can be applied to most ARPGs. Attack and cast speed, not only does it increase your damage by allowing you to proc more hits or more ailments and just basically use your skills more often, but it can be an incredibly useful defensive layer as well. And that is because by attacking faster, you can get out of your attack animation earlier to dodge mechanics and to just keep moving and not be stuck in some like 2-second long mechanic animation. Not only that, but some builds can benefit from defensive layers that are on hit or on crit, in which case you're double dipping into both damage and survivability by investing into attack and cast speed. And anytime you can design your build where investing into something gives you both survivability and damage, that can lead to some incredibly high-performing builds. Same goes with attributes. Strength can give you both damage as well as armor. Granted, the percentages are not very high, but if you can enhance what strength contributes to your build, with my Earthquake Aftershock build, using the Cleaver Solution one-handed axe makes it so that every single point of strength, not only does it give us 4% increased damage to our skill, it also gives us 4% armor, and finally 4% increased water retention. And at that point, investing into strength becomes a no-brainer, and your entire itemization becomes that much simpler. So always look for ways to enhance affixes and attributes that already give you, let's say, damage, to also give you survivability as well. It's a really powerful concept that I've utilized in many of my builds. Something else that I want you guys to notice based on this framework that I've put together here. The number of affixes that you have to worry about when you're doing a hit build is far more than the number of affixes that you need to worry about when you're doing a dot build. Dot builds don't care about crit. Dot builds don't care about armor shred. And crit is actually a fairly difficult stat to max out for many builds. It's not trivial at the very least. Not having to worry about that opens up affixes. Those affixes can be invested in flat damage, attack speed, or many other things that increase the DPS of the build. This is why I believe dot damage builds are really solid season starting builds. They simplify your itemization requirements significantly. It's also why when I look at two different Earthquake setups that I've tested on my end, one being aftershock damage over time, the other one being hit, essentially crit Earthquake, the dot version is far easier to itemize. When it comes to ailments, they're more constrained on the suffix side because ailment percent chance per hit is usually a suffix, so that can be a problem for ailments. But prefixes for ailments are fairly free, so they can easily invest into attack and cast speed and increase percent damage. That's generally what prefixes end up being used up for ailments dot skill builds. And at the very bottom, I've added a few more things to take into consideration. So there are things like damage conversions in the game, where the base damage type of a skill might be necrotic, but through various skill nodes, you can convert that necrotic damage to, let's say, fire or void or something else. If you convert the base damage type of a skill, that means that any adaptive damage added to that skill is going to be converted to that new type as well. However, if you have an item that says 5 to 10 melee void damage, that melee void damage is not going to be converted unless it specifically states in the skill that it converts all damage to a certain damage type. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is you just have to make sure that you line up your main damage type of your skill with your increased percent damage and your rest shred. You don't want to be penetrating necrotic damage if you're actually dealing void damage. There are also ailment conversions that can help out your build. Certain skill nodes can convert all bleed, let's say, to ignites, and that can make certain builds viable as well. There is a really cool example in these Malin's Hubris gloves, which convert 100% of bleed chance to ignite chance. Skill area is something else that you have to take into consideration when you're setting up your build. Larger area might not necessarily give you more damage, but it will make clear a lot smoother. And in the cases of bosses that maybe have massive hitboxes, it might make it so that you shotgun them with more of your projectiles. The main thing to keep in mind here with area is that it does in fact increase the area of the skill and not the radius. And that can be a little bit counterintuitive, at least it was for me. Increasing the area is very lackluster. 100% increase in area doesn't really do as much as you would like it. It essentially increases the radius by a factor of roughly 1.4. And to get 100% increased area is a massive investment in Last Epoch. So investment in area increase is a very situational thing that you might want to consider just to make your runs smoother. Mana recovery is an obvious factor as well. If you have a skill that deals insane damage, but you can't sustain the mana, that's a massive problem. So ensuring mana recovery is solved is paramount to a good build as well. But mana recovery is a topic for another day, so I'll leave it at that. What I mean by vacuum over here is that there are skills like Warcry, which can pull enemies toward you. And that makes for much smoother gameplay. You always want to have as many vacuum skills as possible, just to be able to avoid running around and chasing enemies, at least for melee builds. This is phenomenal for melee builds. And sometimes even vacuum supports can be useful in RPGs just in general. Plus skill levels is another no-brainer that can increase your damage if an additional skill point in that skill tree can be invested into more damage multipliers, just as an example. But yeah, plus skill levels is just something that can enhance many of the existing affixes and skill bonuses that you have. Oh, and I almost forgot one really important aspect when it comes to maximizing your DPS, and that is how subskills within skills function with regards to more multipliers. For example, Lightning Blast is a single target skill in most cases. You can make it chain and bounce around other enemies, so you can kind of make it AoE, but there's also this halo effect node that makes Spark Novas, and Spark Nova is an AoE spell, so it makes up for the weaknesses of Lightning Blast. And best of all, it benefits from all of the more damage multipliers that Lightning Blast gets, like Shatter Shock right here, or even Front Loaded, Storm Razor. All of these benefit subskills as well as the skill itself, with some rare exceptions. Spark Charges is an exception to that, so that's why I chose Lightning Blast to showcase this. But as far as I know, Spark Charges is a skill of its own, and so it does not get treated like a sub-skill. Another good example is the skill Rip Blood, and its sub-skill Blood Splatter. Generic nodes like this one, Rip Blood deals more damage, adds more damage not only to Rip Blood, but also to Blood Splatter. So sub-skills inherit more damage multipliers of the main skill, as long as there aren't any other special wordings when it comes to the skill nodes. So I thought that's really important to mention because there are quite a few builds that leverage subskills as the main damage source. That is what I wanted to share with you on how to min-max your damage in Last Epoch. If you think that I missed something that does not fall into any of these pre-existing categories, please do let me know and I will try to augment it as applicable. And if you did find this guide valuable, please do pass it along, subscribe, like, do whatever you feel like.
All right, I'm leaving town. I'm moving to like Oregon or something.
And I'll see you in the next one where we'll cover defensive layers in Last Epoch. Take it easy and gochiso sama deshita.